Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me today. It's a great honor to be able to speak with you. I've been in Istanbul once and had a great time and hope to be able to go again. I wish I were there today instead of speaking from my home. But we make the best of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to share my screen here. So give me 1 minute. And let's see if we can make this work. Okay, so can you see the screen?
Yes, sir, we can see it.
All right, so then I'm going to do this. And there we go. So let's give it a try. Okay, the title of the talk today is Time Bomb: How the Western Conception of Intelligence is Taking Down Humanity. The main message of my talk today is that the Western conception of intelligence has been and continues to be a disaster. It is taking down humanity. We can do better and implement a conception of intelligence that points to a better future, not a much worse future for humanity. The talk is based in part on a book I wrote that was published in 2021, this past year, called Adaptive Intelligence: Surviving and Thriving in Times of Uncertainty. So this is a picture of lemmings committing mass suicide. And one of the lemmings says, "Shut up, you moron. Do as you've been told. It's for your own good." See, they're jumping off the cliff, apparently committing suicide. But it turns out that the pictures are fakes. Lemmings, in fact, do not commit mass suicide. There was once a Walt Disney movie in which a bunch of lemmings were shown jumping off a cliff committing suicide. They weren't really doing that. And so it became an urban myth that lemmings commit suicide en masse. And what you can see here is that the lemmings are actually having a jumping contest. Only one species, I believe, is known to commit mass suicide. And that species, unfortunately, is humans. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, "Our planet is broken. Humanity is waging what he described as a suicidal war on the natural world. Nature always strikes back and is doing so with gathering force and fury," he told a BBC special event on the environment. And there are just so many examples of how humanity is doing itself in. In a longer version of this talk, I have maybe more than 10 examples, but just to give you a shorter version, one is climate change. You can see the polar bear there with no place to go. It's in Alaska, a state in the US. And then in California and Oregon in the US, we have had out of control wildfires. And for me, that's not just a news headline, because my family and I were in California when these fires, some of these fires were taking place. And we kept having to drive in unexpected directions in order to avoid the wildfires. So, but these are just two examples of many. And then there's overuse of antibiotics. There was our failure to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic. There's our failure to vaccinate sufficient number of people. There's our failure to develop pills in time that will treat it. So there are just so many examples one could give of people's intelligence failing to handle really important problems in the world. In 2017, Shauna Swan and her team of researchers completed a major study. They found that over the past 4 decades, sperm levels among men in Western countries have dropped by more than 50%. They came to this conclusion after examining 185 studies involving close to 45,000 healthy men. So when I talk about humanity committing mass suicide, I'm actually talking about it not just figuratively, but literally. That if men become less able to reproduce, which is apparently what's happening, then we will be literally, not just figuratively, wiping ourselves out as a species. A question one could ask is, what do all of these disasters have in common? And what I would argue is that they are a result, directly or indirectly, of intelligence as conceptualized in the West. High IQ has its advantages. It enables us to do well on IQ tests and other general intelligence or G-based tests. IQ predicts lots of shorter and longer term individual successes. So if you're looking at prediction of school grades and what university you go to and whether you graduate on time and the job you get, IQ has some predictive value, although its predictive value is in some ways overestimated because the very fact of doing well on tests gives you an advantage in society, which then propels you forward. So to some extent, the predictive value of IQ is a self-fulfilling prophecy. By giving more advantages to people who test better, we allow them to proceed. When I was in Istanbul, I don't know if it's still true, I asked how much emphasis Turkish people put on standardized tests. And I was told at the time, and it may have changed, that they put a lot of emphasis on standardized tests. And the reason is that if they didn't, then what would end up carrying a lot of weight is people's connections, their social status, their pull, their politics. And so at the time, the hope was to create more of a meritocracy. But even long-term success for the individual, whether it's IQ-based or based on something else, can be short-term success for humanity. In other words, creating a meritocracy based on individual accomplishments sometimes works out poorly. And a reason for that is called the tragedy of the commons. And the idea here is that at least in early New England, part of the United States, farmers used to have their cattle graze on common land, on pasture. And so what a smart farmer would do is to have his cattle graze on as much pasture as possible to fatten the cattle to make it worth more at market. So individually, the smart thing to do was to have your cattle eat as much of that grass as possible. The problem, of course, was that there was only a fixed amount of grass. So if more and more farmers have their cattle eat more and more grass, eventually there's no grass left. So what was good in the short term for the individual was bad in the long term collectively. So the individualist emphasis resulted in a short-term focus that in the long term resulted in a collective loss. You can see this in traffic jams, and I remember that Istanbul has its share of traffic jams. And each of the people in the car is saying, if these idiots would just take the bus, I could be home by now. So the idea of the car is that each individual will get home faster, but if too many people use cars and there's not enough room for them, then you get a traffic jam. So the characteristics that in the short run lead to individual success, including on IQ tests or related tests that are like IQ tests, may be called something else, often lead to adverse, negative, long-term collective outcomes. What's good for the individual in the short term may be bad for the group in the long term. Each individual's success sometimes has brought humanity and many other species closer to collapse. Moreover, conventional G-based or general intelligence-based tests, although standardized, are not necessarily fair to everyone. So in this example, the tester is asking all of the different animals to climb the tree. And obviously, climbing a tree might be an intelligence test for some of them, but it won't be for all of them. And the idea is that the same applies to the standardized tests that psychologists use, that different people come into the tests with different backgrounds, different enculturation, different socialization, different schooling, different opportunities. And when you give them the same test, the test doesn't necessarily tell you the same thing about everyone taking the test. Now, there's some people like Steven Pinker at Harvard who believe that things are getting better, that everything's just getting better. But the problem is not just today, tomorrow, or the next day, but over the long term for our children and grandchildren. So yes, you can find many things that are better today, but if you look into the future, there's some very troubling signs. And this is from a movie called The Road about a dystopian future. So what I worry about is I have 5 children and 5 grandchildren, and I worry about the world that we're creating for my children and grandchildren, but also for yours. And the problems that we're creating are starting right now: the fires, the parched earth, the hurricanes. And you may say, what does this have to do with intelligence? Well, many of these problems are caused by industrialization, things that in themselves seem pretty smart. Hey, it's smart to create a car. Hey, it's smart to create factories. Hey, it's smart to do fracking for oil. So in the short term, these forms of industrialization and economic development may seem like a good idea, but without any kinds of controls in the long term, these are the kinds of things you get. And they're not happening just in the future. They are happening right now. Society can perpetuate its socioeconomic class structure and call it meritocracy. So again, in a longer version of the talk, I say more about this. But the idea is that tests, psychological tests, the idea originally was a good one. It was to create a meritocracy so that instead of your future being determined by how much money your parents have or their politics or their social connections or their wealth or whatever, you would have tests that would measure merit. But what psychologists didn't realize in the beginning is that the scores on these tests are very much dependent on the kinds of opportunities that your society and your family provide you, so that some people, as the figure shows, go into the tests with a great advantage and others have no advantages at all. So it's not that the tests tell you about some inborn trait, but rather the interaction of traits with the kinds of environments in which you've been brought up. So I've been talking about what I believe is wrong with the current system that psychologists in part have created of tests of intelligence or different kinds of proxy tests with different names, all of which correlate highly with each other. So what am I suggesting that we do instead? What I'm suggesting is that we can do better and we can have a conception of intelligence as adapting to the environment rather than destroying the environment and themselves in the process. So we do have a choice and we need to make a choice. So what I have suggested, among other suggestions, is that instead of putting so much emphasis on academic skills, and in the end, there are many people with high levels of academic skills who turn out not to be very successful in their lives. We emphasize what I call active concerned citizenship and ethical leadership. And the bases for those are creativity, common sense, wisdom, and some analytical skills that I'll talk about later. Conventional tests of intelligence, the Stanford, Binet, the Wechsler, and related tests measure the analytical part, the domain general analytical part. They don't measure creativity, common sense, wisdom, and the like. Now, the interesting thing is that the elements I just described are already included in many Eastern and indigenous conceptions of intelligence. So in a way, there's nothing new in what I'm suggesting. Rural Kenyan conceptions of intelligence have 4 parts to intelligence, what they call Rieko, which is knowledge, ability, skills, and is close to general intelligence. Luro, which is respect and other aspects of practical intelligence. Paro, which is initiative and other aspects of creativity. And Winjo, which is comprehension of the complexities of a problem situation and other aspects of wisdom. So what I'm saying is that my particular theory of adaptive intelligence has roots in indigenous conceptions of intelligence. It's not particularly new. It's the Western conception that I believe is inadequate. So let's start off talking about the first of those elements, which is creativity and creative intelligence, which is usually not measured by conventional tests. Creativity is generating new ideas and products that are both novel and useful. So some examples of creativity tasks we have used in our research are things like design an experiment on a topic of your choice, draw a picture of the beginning of time, or suppose the Nazis had won World War II. What would the world be like today? Write a creative story using the title, Social Media Died Today. Draw an advertisement for a new brand of bow tie. Create an exciting slogan for your school and create a new game. So the idea is we give our participants a choice because creativity is largely domain specific. People aren't creative in everything. Some are more creative writers or artists or scientists or sculptors or musicians or whatever. So we give people a choice of the domain in which they want to be creative. Here's an example of a creative essay that we got when we used the AIR test for admissions to Tufts University. I was Dean of Arts and Sciences at Tufts at the time, and we were trying to expand the admissions process to identify students who were not only conventionally academically smart, but also creatively smart. So here's the essay. If the Trojans had heeded Laocoon's advice and thrown Odysseus's wooden horse into the sea, they would have defeated the Greeks at Troy. Aeneas would then never have had reason to flee the city, and he would never have ventured to Italy to found Rome. Without Rome, neither the Roman Republic nor the Roman Empire would have existed. Concrete, the arch, plumbing, and the sauna might never have been invented. The modern implications of Rome never having existed are indeed drastic. Lacking even concrete floors, people would resort to sleeping in the mud, and without plumbing or saunas, they would be perpetually filthy and generally quite chilly. France could not have built the base of the Eiffel Tower without arches, so tourists would be unable to purchase miniature collectible towers in Parisian convenience stores. So this is what we rated to be a highly creative essay, and it was written by someone who took university admissions tests in the United States, but didn't have a particularly high score on the verbal measure. The point being that the tests, at least that we use, may measure your reading or your vocabulary, but they don't measure verbal creativity. And when we looked at the efficacy of our tests, in the United States, a test called the SAT is often used for university admissions. And what we found is that when we added our creative tests, examples of which I showed you, to the SAT, we pretty much doubled prediction of academic success. That's a huge increase. In other words, simply looking at a person's creativity, if all you care about is their academic performance, it doubled prediction. And that was a study that was done around the country of the United States in many different high schools and universities. So the results were very good. Moreover, we found that not only did our test double prediction, but it significantly reduced racial and ethnic group differences. So the red bars are the conventional SAT admissions test, and the green and blue bars are our test. And the higher the bar, the more distinction there is among racial and ethnic groups. So what we found is that by using creativity-based items, we could greatly increase prediction, but decrease differences across racial and ethnic groups. So we talked a little bit about creativity. Now let's talk about common sense or practical intelligence. And this is a cartoon called Dilbert. And a job interviewer says, wow, you have 3 master's degrees and a PhD. Yes, it's all very impressive, but interestingly, I have no common sense whatsoever. And then the interviewer says, that's not the sort of thing you should say during a job interview. And the job candidate says, I don't see why not. So this is the idea is it's a cartoon, but it's consistent with our research findings. And that is that academic intelligence, or the kind of intelligence that brings you good grades, does not predict terribly well to practical intelligence or common sense. Common sense or practical intelligence is using your knowledge and your skills effectively to adapt to, shape, and select environments. So adapt to environments means you change yourself to fit the environment. Shape environments means you change the environments to fit you, and select environments means you find some other place to be. So, for example, in a relationship with a boy or a girl, if you change yourself because you want to make the relationship work, you adapt. If you try to change your partner to change the relationship, you're shaping. And if you decide this relationship isn't working, I have to find another boy or girl, you're selecting a new environment. So that's practical intelligence. And it's the same with jobs. With jobs, you can adapt, you can shape, or you can get out. Now, I've done all 3. I've sometimes changed myself to fit the job requirements. Sometimes I've tried to shape the environment I'm in to be a better fit to me. And I quit a big job because it was just in the wrong place. So how do we measure common sense or practical intelligence? Well, some examples of items we've used are show how you could persuade a friend of yours to adopt some idea that the friend initially doesn't like. Or you see a movie of students trying to get a mattress up to the 2nd floor, but there's a winding staircase. And so the item is, in the movie you just saw, how can the students get the mattress to the 2nd floor, given that it does not fit up the winding staircase? Or in another movie, a student is asking a professor for a letter of recommendation for graduate school. And the question is, in the movie you just saw, what should the student do given that the professor from whom she wants a letter of recommendation obviously does not know who she is, does not recognize her? So the student realized that the professor didn't know who she was. Now what does she do? Or another is, which of the following strategies would you use to study for an essay test? And another is, you see romantic couples, boys and girls, and half of the couples are real. In other words, there are a boy and a girl involved in a romantic relationship, and half are fake. The boy and girl don't even know each other. They were just paired for the purposes of our experiment. And your task is to figure out which are the real couples and which are the fake couples given nonverbal cues. And what we found is that using tests of practical intelligence or common sense increased prediction of grade point average, not as much as the creative test, but nevertheless increased. So the tests also seem to be effective. Practical intelligence matters everywhere. Here are honeybee gatherers searching for beehives. So they're looking for where are the beehives where we can get the honey. And for them, that's a livelihood. But for us, how good would we be at searching for obscure beehives? So the point is that what constitutes practical intelligence or common sense differs from one place and one job to another. We did a project in Kenya on practical intelligence, and here is the school in which we worked. So it was very different from the kind of school that you may be familiar with. And here's an example of an item. A small child in your family has homa. She has a sore throat, headache, and fever. She has been sick for 3 days. Which of the five Yad Naya Luo herbal medicines can treat homa? And then you're given a choice of Chamama, Kaladali, Abuo, Agaka, and Ahundo. So if you were asked to take this test, or my kids were asked to take this test, they would score a chance. They just wouldn't know any of these items. But for these kids in rural Kenya, this is really important practical knowledge. And the reason is that they're constantly besieged by parasitic illnesses like malaria, schistosomiasis, hookworm, whipworm, and the like. And so these are correlations of our TK or practical tacit knowledge scores with IQ-like tests. And if you look at the first column, what you'll see is that all the correlations are negative. In other words, the better you did on the tacit knowledge or practical intelligence test, the worse you did on the IQ test, which is the opposite of what you would predict based on standard psychological theories. I should say before I go on that you might wonder, well, why would practical intelligence show a negative correlation with IQ? And the reason is that in rural Kenyan society, if adults see you as smart, then what happens is they'll take you out of school. So a master wants you as an apprentice, and they will offer to train you, and that's the way you'll make money. But the kids who are not seen as smart are not offered jobs by masters of trades, and so they stay in school. So the longer you stay in school, the less smart you're considered, and the less you develop the practical skills you'll need for success, but the more you develop academic skills. And there's one other thing I do want to say, and that is when we submitted this article to a journal, one of the comments we got from a reviewer is, well, this is nice, but this is rural Kenya. We're a developed society. This has nothing to do with us. And in retrospect, I think that comment was ironic because it was before COVID-19. And what COVID-19 has shown is how utterly useless just standard IQ academic-based skills are for predicting who will show the common sense to adapt to a really vicious killer using skills you don't learn in school. So the skills that were important in rural Kenya when we did the study are important all over the world today. The general point is that common sense is not the same as IQ. One can be high in both or low in both, but also high in one and low in the other. So let's now talk about wisdom. In wisdom, in my view, is using your knowledge and skills toward a common good by balancing your own, others, and larger interests over the long as well as the short term through the infusion of positive ethical values. So these are examples of wisdom problems we've used in our research. There are two countries in the Middle East, they're imaginary, Korah and Tamwin. The Taran River flows in the direction from Korah to Tamwin. Tamwin claims that Korah is diverting more than its fair share of water from the river. It's getting ready to go to war over this precious water resource. What should the two countries do to avert the war? Or today we're trying to avert a war in Ukraine, and a number of countries are trying to figure out what they can do to avert war in Ukraine. Another example of wisdom problem is give an example of how some passion you have in your life now could be turned for a common good when you grow older. A third example is Richard and Jennifer broke up. They both left you text messages that they want to talk to you about what happened. You know they both will want you to take their side. What should you do? We used these kinds of creative, analytic, practical, and wisdom-based problems at Tufts to admit students. And just to summarize what we found that we could admit students to this very selective university who were not top scorers on standardized tests, but who showed the skills of creativity, practical intelligence, as wisdom that you need for success. And they did very well in the school. So there's one other set of studies I want to tell you about, and that is I used to think that standardized tests at least were good in measuring analytical abilities. Now I'm not so sure. And the reason is we did a series of studies at Cornell, and what we're interested in is if you want to select people for STEM or psychology graduate programs or behavioral science graduate programs, can you do better than conventional standardized tests? And the question was, is STEM reasoning, is scientific reasoning the same as what is measured by domain general IQ proxies or by more domain-specific tests? So we used 3 tests of scientific reasoning. One was of hypothesis generation, one was of drawing conclusions, and one was of generating experiments. So what the tests were is exactly what you do in science. We found that the 3 tests of scientific reasoning were positively correlated with each other. Tests of fluid intelligence were positively correlated with each other. But in our sample, the tests of scientific reasoning showed trivial, or in some cases, negative correlations with the fluid ability measures. In other words, if you want to admit students to a psychology or STEM graduate program, using IQ tests is not a particularly good way to do it. The tests of scientific reasoning appear to go beyond what standard IQ tests measure to measure skills that are more relevant for science success. So I've talked about analytical, creative, practical, and wisdom-based abilities. Clearly, there are other things that also matter for success. Intrinsic motivation, one's mindset, passion for making a difference, active concerned citizenship, specific talents, emotional intelligence, rational thinking, critical thinking, integrity. There are other things that matter. I'm not saying that's all, but the point is that if we want to think about who is it who's intelligent in the sense of adaptation to the real world, not to just some academic corner of it, you need to go beyond conventional tests. If you look at medical tests from the beginning of the 20th century, like 1900, no one would want to use those medical tests today to diagnose things like cancer or heart disease or AIDS. They didn't even know about AIDS. Yet in the psychometric business and psychology, we're still using tests that are very similar to those that were used in 1905 by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. So there are many reasons why we're still stuck on these old tests, and I'm not going to try to go over all of them. But my point is that we're stuck, we're entrenched. We're using tests that may have reflected a world of 1900, but that do not well reflect the world of 2022. The Western conception of intelligence values people who are very good at doing what they're told to do and very good at fitting into an existing cognitive, social, and economic structure. Even creative professions often value those who are creative, working within entrenched paradigms and who do not challenge the existing structure of the field. People who are highly creative or wise do not fit well into this structure and are challenged at every turn to stay in their place. So little changes because the existing power structure, which is often hidden, does not allow it to change, and that spells a dismal future. We're running out of time. The problems facing the world are enormous, and psychologists and other behavioral scientists often have reacted as though these problems are not their problem. They have persisted, especially in the field of intelligence and related fields, in defining problems narrowly, failing to realize that if the world falls apart, there won't be a next generation to continue small and self-satisfied approaches to small problems, much less small approaches to big problems. What I've said, I just had a meeting of my research group. We meet once a week. And I said to my research group at Cornell that what is going on in psychology now reminds me of the musicians playing on the Titanic. The ship is sinking. It's slowly going down into the water. And the musicians are worried about playing nicely in their intonation and their rhythm and their musicality while the ship sinks. And that's what I believe we are doing in psychology. The ship of the world is sinking, and we're worried about whether we're getting our scientific notes right. The state of Louisiana in the United States is losing a football field's worth of land every hour and a half. That's huge. Engineers are in a race to prevent the state from sinking into oblivion. Look, compare the map view of Louisiana to the actual view. This is what a map looks like that shows the state of Louisiana in the United States. This is what the state actually looks like now. Much of it is sunk. And that's what's happening while we worry about our little experiments in the laboratory. The world is falling apart. I believe that we're running the wrong race. That as psychologists, but in science in general, and certainly in politics, we're running in one direction, but the state of the world requires us to run in a different direction. What we need to be thinking about, and here's where I think we've made a fundamental error, a category error, is we thought that by measuring intelligence, we would create a meritocracy that we wouldn't have if we just used family wealth and status and politics and so on. But I think that what really matters is not how much intelligence you have as traditionally defined, but rather how you deploy it. And what has happened is that our society, I can't speak for Turkey, has developed a transactional notion of intelligence. Intelligence is where you give us something, you get good grades, you please your teachers, you get into a good university, you do all the things we tell you to, and in exchange, we'll do something for you. We'll give you more resources. We'll give you more opportunities. We'll give you the world, but just do what you're told to do. It's transactional. You do something for us, we do something for you. We do something for you, you do something for us. And instead, what we need is a more transformational notion of the deployment of intelligence. We need people, we need to develop students who want to make the world a better place. They don't just care about, will I have a big house? Will I have a nice car? Will I be well connected? Their purpose in life is they realize the world is kind of falling apart in many ways. And they're going to try to make a positive, meaningful, and potentially enduring difference to the world. They want to make a difference, a transformational difference. So let's make the world a better place. That to me is what intelligence should be about, not your score on an IQ test and what it could buy you. Thank you very much for listening. And I would be glad to answer any questions you might have. So
thank you so much, Professor, for your very eye-opening and inspirational speech. If you allow me, I will move on to the questions. There was a set of questions that we took before the whole event. I took it off. Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, a list of like just a few questions.
Sure.
One is that, do you have any advices for young psychology students that are new to the field who are studying?
Yeah, so my main advice, I do have a piece of advice. Thank you for asking. So this is the best piece of advice I can give you, single piece. It's about a lesson I learned in graduate school. I was a first-year student at Stanford University. My advisor was a professor named Gordon Bauer. And Professor Bauer had us over for dinner, and he asked us what we want to study in graduate school. And everyone knew that what he wanted to hear was semantic memory, because that's what he studied. There were 5 first-year students. I was one of them. So Bauer asked the first student, what do you want to study? And the student said, semantic memory. And then he asked the second student, what do you want to study? And the second student said, semantic memory. I knew that guy was lying, because I knew the guy, he didn't want to study semantic memory. He was sucking up to the professor. He asked the third guy, what do you want to study? And the third guy says, semantic memory. So then he comes to the fourth guy, and the fourth guy is me. And I just heard 3 guys say they want to study semantic memory. And I didn't want to study semantic memory. I wanted to study intelligence, because as a kid, I did poorly on IQ tests, and I wanted to figure out why. But there was enormous social pressure and professional pressure, obviously, to say semantic memory. Now, if I were a coward, if I were a sucker, if I were just a blind follower, I would say semantic memory. But if I had courage, and if I were true to myself, and you can tell I'm the kind of person who's true to myself, then of course I would say intelligent. So I said semantic memory. I chickened out. I was a coward. And I remember that night, I went home, how embarrassed I felt that I sold myself out. I sold out. And I said to myself that night, my first year in graduate school, I was 22 years old. I said, I'm never going to do that again. Never in my life am I going to do that again. And I never have. So my one piece of advice, if I get one, is there's huge pressure at every stage of career. It doesn't end. It's not only when you're 21. It's when you're 31, 41, 51, 60. It never ends. To do certain things, to say certain things, to be a certain person, and not to be true to yourself. And, you know, academia doesn't pay that well. It's a lot of work. You know, it's a hard job. If you're going to do it, at least be true to yourself. Figure out where your passion is, who you are, and then be that person. Resist the pressures that will be put on you. I had all those pressures. My mother wanted me to go to law school. Bauer wanted me to study semantic memory. I mean, you know, on and on it went. Resist the pressure, be true to yourself. All through my career, I've had so much pressure. I was president of a university. They wanted me to say things I didn't believe. I just friggin' resigned. Be true to yourself. And that's the way you'll make a positive, meaningful, enduring difference to the world.
Thank you so much for your precious advice. I have a few more questions written here. Meanwhile, I'm addressing the audience. If you have questions, you can write them in the chat and I will read them to the professor, or you can raise your hand emoji and then we will give the mic to you. But before that, there's questions from the forum. They are related to your theory of triangular theory of love. One person asked, how do you define love?
Okay. So I have defined love in what I call a duplex theory, which means there are two parts. One part is in terms of intimacy, passion, and commitment, where intimacy is your feelings of closeness, connectedness, friendship, communication, sort of being just, you know, pals with someone. Passion is how excited you are by the person, how, you know, they really make you, wow, I mean, I have to be with this person. And commitment is that you decide you're going to stay with them, that you're in it for good. So what we have found in our research is that people tend to be happier in relationships as a function of two things. One is that they have more of intimacy, passion, and commitment, but the other is that they match their partner. In other words, you both want the same things, so that if one person wants intimacy, but the other doesn't care about intimacy, they only care about passion, it's not going to work so well. You want to be with someone who wants the same things. The other part of the theory, of the duplex theory, is that everyone has a set of stories about what they believe love to be. So what is a story? A story is something you start forming from your birth about what you mean by love. And some people by love mean like a fairy tale, a prince and a princess. Very romantic notion. Some mean a business. We're like a business, you know, like we have a house, we have kids, we have a gardener, we have this, we have that, and we run it like a business. Some people have a story about a journey that they take together. It's like a trip. Some people have a horror story about abuse and being abused. And what we have found is, again, people are happier in relationships when their stories match. For example, if one person has a business story and the other has a fairy tale story, no matter how much you're attracted to the person and you have the same values, same roles, if you have different stories, it's really hard to make the relationship work. So those are the two things I would look for. do you match each other in terms of intimacy, passion, and commitment? And do you have matching stories of what love is?
Thank you so much, dear professor. Now we have one new question in the chat. Can I read it for you?
Sure.
So, Özgün Şahinoğlu asks, Sir, I do have a question for you, if you do not mind. We have a concept of uneducated intelligence where the skills of a blue-collar technician is compared to an academically educated engineer in a manner where their applied knowledge is viewed superior to the academic training itself. Conceptually, similar anecdotes can be seen in other countries such as the UK, where the achievement of blokes in a shed is turned into a myth over the similar achievements of the academics. Could you comment on the validity of such views in relation to the topic of your lecture on intelligence?
Yeah. So one of the things that seems to be almost a natural human tendency is to create false dichotomies. It's to believe it's either or. And as I said in my talk, there are thousands of studies showing that academic intelligence, or IQ, is predictive of many things. It just is. I mean, it's predictive not only of school success, it's predictive of income, it's predictive of health behavior, it's predictive of marital success, it's predictive of how you eat, predictive of a lot of things. So, as I said early in the talk, my goal is not to say it's either or. It's not that academic intelligence doesn't matter. It clearly does. There are just too many studies that show it does. I think that the problem the educational system has made is to define intelligence too narrowly, is to say, yes, that matters, but it's not all that matters. It also matters how creative you are. Because there are many people who are high in IQ, they're very good at doing what they're told to do, but they're not good at coming up with their own ideas. I'm an honorary professor at the University of Heidelberg, where students in Germany are admitted by their grades to graduate school. And one of the professors said to me that the problem with that system is it identifies people who are very good at doing what they're told to do. That's an important skill to have, but it's not the only skill that matters. You also want people who are creative. You also want people who have common sense, and common sense is different from academic intelligence. And most of all, in my view, you want people who are wise, who will use their knowledge and their intelligence, not just to benefit themselves, but to benefit others as well. So I don't see it as really a legitimate dichotomy. It's not this or that. All these things matter. And ideally, we would broaden our notion of intelligence to include all of them.
Thank you so much for your answer, Professor. Now, if you still have time, there's a person that's raising their hand.
Okay.
Saliha Nurdan, you can open your mic.
Thank you. What I want to ask is, you mentioned psychologists today are like musicians in Titanic, and that analogy is more than relevant in nowadays Turkey, sadly. What I want to ask is, yes, I do feel like a musician in a shrinking ship, but what else can I do as a person, like as an individual about that?
Yeah, I've asked the same question. I should tell you something. I gave a talk in Boston just a few years ago. I started as an assistant professor at age 25. When I gave the talk, I was, I don't know, 68. I don't remember. And I said, I feel like a failure because all these years, nothing has changed. It's gotten worse. And someone in the audience raised their hand and said, you know, you're not a failure till you give up. And I thought, that's right. So how am I going to do this so I don't give up? So what do I try to do? Right now, I'm writing a paper on, I call it sort of the Voldemort effect, how, you know, when the world is falling apart, teachers need to teach kids not only sort of academic stuff, but what can you do personally to make the world better? What kinds of things can you do individually to lessen pollution? And there are things you could do: drive less, or have a more fuel efficient car, or don't overheat, or don't over air condition. And for any one person, it's not a big deal, but if a lot of people did it, that would help. A second thing that I think is important is these days is combating misinformation. There's a tremendous, God, in my country, the amount of misinformation that's purposely being put forward is enormous for political gain. You can try to combat misinformation. What I try to do, I teach a course on creativity. I'm teaching it right now. I teach it Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I put an emphasis on what I call transformational creativity. In other words, you can use creativity for good or bad. You know, the people who go to Silicon Valley to work for Facebook, a lot of them end up using their creativity to get people to do more clicks, to make more money for the company and for the advertisers. Well, you don't have to do that kind of a job. You don't have, all right, it pays well. And if that's all you care about, you know, is I want to live in a nice house, then maybe you'll try to manipulate people to click more. But you can take a job where you think you're doing something good for the world. I have 2 older kids. I have 5 kids. And both of them, you know, they're both smart kids, and they chose jobs where they can make a positive difference. Seth is CEO of an elder healthcare company, and the company goes into people's houses to give healthcare to people who can't get to a hospital or try to live by themselves. Sarah, my daughter, is a law professor at Duke, and she does work on poverty law, showing how the legal system in the United States screws poor people. So they made a choice. They could have done a lot. My daughter started as a lawyer representing companies against people. She quit. That was her choice. She could have made much more money being a company lawyer, you know, a corporate lawyer. She decided to do poverty law instead and to take a salary cut. So we all can make choices every day, I think, as to whether we're going to try to make the world a better place or whether we just don't frigging care. And what you can do is care and ask yourself, what kinds of things can I do, even small, even with your kids or your students or in your own life, that will make some kind of a difference. I hear it's 1 o'clock, so I guess we're out of time. I really thank you for having me today, and I hope next time I get to see you in Istanbul.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
sir.